But here you have Zelensky caught between impossible demands put to him by an invader from the east, by Russia, and impossible demands put to him by the country that up until recently was helping Ukraine resist. And if it's a choice between which of those is the worse, that just tells you how tragic the situation now is, that the United States has effectively changed sides.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Keir Giles, Russia expert at Chatham House and author of many books, including Who Will Defend Europe. Keir, welcome.
Hello again.
Now, a lot to discuss. We should say we're recording this as Donald Trump is meeting Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House, in the Oval Office. So we're getting some of the lines from that meeting all the time. Here's what we know so far. Zelensky has told Trump there should be no compromises with Putin, and he's brought some photographs of Ukrainian prisoners of war that he showed to the president and to the gathered press in the Oval Office. Zelensky has stressed the importance of US aid continuing. Trump has said that the US will continue sending Ukraine weapons, but hopefully not many more. He says NATO and Europe need to step up. We are also expecting both leaders to sign the minerals deal at some point today, although the exact details remain unclear. And in the last few minutes, we've just had this line that apparently Donald Trump has told Zelensky to be thankful, and he's accused Ukraine's president of gambling with World War III. Keir, obviously this is coming at us thick and fast, but from what we've heard there, what is your reaction?
Well, we should bear in mind that we're only hearing snippets of the conversation. We're getting the highlights as opposed to a live feed. But it has to be said, yes, all of those snippets are really not very encouraging. What we seem to be seeing is Trump reverting to type, Trump behaving exactly as people who saw his arrival with trepidation for Ukraine were expecting him to do. Now, there have been brief flashes of Trump behaving out of character that we've seen throughout this process, as, for example, when he appeared to be willing to put leverage on Putin as well as Zelensky to bring the conflict to an end with the threat of tariffs, taxes, and sanctions. And then as recently as yesterday, when he apparently denied all recollection of having called Zelensky a dictator. But now there's a very public statement of that hostile attitude of the Trump administration to Ukraine, which has actually apparently been distinctly specified by Trump, saying he is not for Ukraine, he's for Russia and Ukraine. So that in itself is enough of an indication of just how far away the new United States is from any guarantee for European security.
I suppose it would always be difficult for Volodymyr Zelensky to gauge the mood and to get the tone right. We saw Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, in the Oval Office yesterday. By all accounts, that visit went very well. And Starmer chose flattery, essentially, as a tactic, presenting Trump with a letter from King Charles, inviting him on what was described as an unprecedented second state visit, praising him for changing the conversation on Ukraine. But of course, Keir Starmer's in a different situation to Zelensky. Things are far more urgent for Ukraine. He probably doesn't have the luxury of taking that tone.
Absolutely. Starmer turned on the smarm, and it seems to have worked, in as much as anything that a conscious decision by a leader going in to see Trump is going to have any effect on the outcome of the meeting, as opposed to the state of Trump's digestion. But yes, Zelensky doesn't have those options available to him. But in a way, this is the choice that faces Europe as a whole. Do they flatter Trump? Do they smarm him? Do they try to keep him on side and hope that the United States is still going to be engaged with protecting the continent against Russia? Or do they follow the alternative line, which is recognizing that the United States for the foreseeable future is not on side and take their own steps to secure their own future?
On the minerals deal, and as I said, we don't know the details of it yet. Do you think this is in Ukraine's long-term security interest? Because the furthest Donald Trump was willing to go yesterday when speaking to Keir Starmer in terms of any security backstop or guarantee was to say, look, if you've got American contractors on the ground in Ukraine exploiting the country's mineral resources, essentially Vladimir Putin wouldn't be stupid enough to go at Ukraine again if you've got the Americans there. Is that enough of a security guarantee for Zelensky?
Absolutely not, but we are a long way further forward than the initial shape of the deal as we understand it. A lot is still to be clarified, but this investment fund, jointly managed by the United States and Ukraine, into which profits from development of Ukrainian natural resources is supposed to be paid, is a lot better than simply handing over the cash to the Americans, which was the initial proposal. And that, of course, would not have needed any US presence in Ukraine at all to simply demand that the proceeds are paid back for a notional, in fact, wildly invented invented figure for how much aid the United States has already given to Ukraine on a non-reciprocal basis, actually a grant rather than a loan. So in that respect, we're further forward, but all of those key details still unspecified. Who exactly is going to be spending the money when it's accrued? Who's going to be investing in order to make sure that it actually happens? And we still have the situation where so much of the mineral resources under discussion are actually in territory currently occupied by Russia. So what is to stop Trump making a similar deal with Russia to work in the occupied territories?
The principle of it here, are you comfortable with it? Because you do hear some people say, look, this is kind of mercantilism, this is colonialism, this is America exploiting Ukraine in its hour of need to plunder its natural resources.
Well, those are all very polite words for an overt act of extortion and blackmail. Am I comfortable with it? No, absolutely not. I'm not aware of anybody that is comfortable of it outside the immediate surroundings of Trump. It is the exploitation of the vulnerable position that Zelensky finds himself in, and Ukraine as a country finds itself in, and it is taking advantage of the vulnerability that they are suffering as a result of being under savage attack for 3 years.
Do you think Vladimir Putin, if there were American contractors on the ground in Ukraine, do you think Vladimir Putin would be deterred from going again and again?
Deterred from what, of course, is always the really important question. And of course, let's not forget that this is happening in the context of the United States rehabilitating Russia, bringing it in from the cold, rapidly moving to restore those diplomatic relations. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that that state of hostilities is going to continue in the way that we're thinking about an invasion forward of Ukraine that has been the obvious scenario for if an incomplete ceasefire, a ceasefire without security guarantees is put in place. There are plenty of other ways that Russia can push forward militarily or diplomatically to take advantage of the fact that they have been forgiven an act of aggression by the United States and encouraged to take a seat at the table again.
What other ways could they still push forward? Would that be about Ukraine, or would that be going for, say, the Baltic states or Moldova?
Or not even necessarily rolling any tanks across any borders. Let's not forget that what Russia aspires to and what Russia has consistently demanded from Europe looks like a return to the past. And the so-called new European security architecture that we heard so much about in previous decades is actually mirrored in the so-called treaty proposals that were put forward by Ukraine to NATO and to the United States just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that is effectively the rolling back of NATO, the rolling back of security guarantees for Eastern Europe, the removal of the United States from Europe, the breaking of those transatlantic links, the re-establishment of Russia as a major player in European security. And all of those things are precisely what are now being handed to Moscow.
Do you worry that Donald Trump, even if he is not withdrawing the US from NATO as he has previously threatened to do, is essentially rendering it impotent? Because I don't know if you agree with this, Keir, but it strikes me as hard to believe that, let's say Vladimir Putin did decide to invade one of the Baltic states, that America would act to enact Article 5.
Well, withdrawal from NATO has always been a red herring because no country needs to withdraw from NATO in order to render it pointless by not meeting its NATO commitments, most of all the United States. Anybody that's read the Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the one that says an attack on one member should be considered an attack on all, is not going to be reassured about the current state of American assurances about European security, because if you read to the end, it becomes plain that nobody actually is obliged to do anything. And yes, the way in which the United States has been discussing the partnership, literally using the word partner, with Russia, and of course challenging those long-held security assumptions about Europe being dependent on the United States to protect itself, doesn't inspire confidence. And of course that upends all of the assumptions about not only security architecture overall, but how, for instance, the British armed forces have structured themselves for decades, assuming that they're always going to be fighting alongside the United States, not without their support.
Were you to have, as has been mooted, European peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine, can you see any scenario that the US might, for instance, provide air cover?
Well, that has been, of course, explicitly ruled out more than once by the United States. And it doesn't help, of course, that the word peacekeeping has been thrown about so much, but this is not the kind of force that would be necessary in order to actually maintain peace in Ukraine. It will inevitably be challenged by Russia. It needs to be a force that is fully capable of protecting itself. And if the United States is to be believed, it has to be able to do that without US support. And that is a very different shape from the kind of coalition effort that British and other European forces might have envisaged when thinking about trying to keep Russia out of Europe.
And again, I suppose the fear is if Vladimir Putin thinks, well, okay, I'll move on these peacekeeping troops. I don't really care that there's a token presence of British and French and maybe a few other countries in Ukraine. What does America do then? Does it just stand by?
Well, that's exactly right. And we need to look back over the past history of ceasefire agreements that have come about as a result of Russia attacking one of its neighbors. Because time and time again, you have exactly the same pattern happening. You have a ceasefire that is drafted in Moscow and then imposed on the victim, not by Russia itself, but by Western powers like France, like Germany, the United States. Same thing over and over again in Georgia in 2008, in Syria in 2015, 2016, in Ukraine itself under the Minsk agreements. And what that pattern results in is tying the hands of the victim of aggression, but leaving Russia free to unfreeze the conflict whenever it wants to and to ignore the terms of the ceasefire in the meantime. That seems to be what we are heading towards in the case of Ukraine again, with once again an externally imposed ceasefire which is unsustainable and leaves Russia free to pursue its intended course of action at a time of its choosing.
Just to bring you another update here from some of the conversations that have been taking place in the Oval Office. JD Vance at one point reportedly said, I think it's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. By all accounts, from what we're hearing, this doesn't sound like a particularly friendly meeting. How worried are you that this could put back the Ukrainian cause yet further?
Well, it's hard really to see how much further back it could be put because, of course, Zelensky is moving into a hostile conversation, and anything that is clawed back from that, those extortionate demands that the United States have been putting on Ukraine, and also, of course, meeting all of Russia's demands on Ukraine and attempting to enforce them as well. There's not much further back you can go from that, but certainly it's been a very, from what we gather from the reporting that is coming out from the Oval Office, a frosty and a hostile reception rather than one which is cooperative and looking for any kind of sustainable peace deal, which actually recognizes the injustice of the situation and the fact that Russia, as the aggressor, should not be rewarded for what it has done.
I mentioned that one of the things Trump has said in the Oval Office is that Europe needs to step up. How should Europe respond to this? If we are seeing a further disintegration of the relationship between Kyiv and Washington, what should the leaders of France and Germany and the UK be doing?
Well, again, that comes back to that fundamental choice of do they attempt to work with Trump as best they can, or do they recognize that the relationship on which their security is rested is now fundamentally disrupted and go against Trump's wishes by attempting to protect themselves? And of course, protecting themselves begins with as much support to Ukraine as can be provided, because Ukraine still, as it has been since 2014, is holding the front line for the whole of Europe. So the defense of France and the defense of UK start on that front line in Ukraine now.
Is there any scenario, in your view, that without US military aid, let's say Trump were to withdraw US military aid from Ukraine altogether, that Ukraine could fight on if Britain, France, Germany, other European NATO allies increased what they're prepared to give Kyiv?
Well, Ukraine is not going to accept an outcome to this conflict that is effectively national suicide. And so many of the terms and so many of the ideas for bringing the conflict to an end do in fact constitute precisely that. We've had US envoys talking about the draft communique from Istanbul in 2022 at a very early stage of the war, negotiations supposedly looking towards a peace settlement as a potential outcome for the war. But that was, in effect, the complete surrender and capitulation of Ukraine and its demilitarization to leave it at Russia's mercy for the indefinite future. That is not something that is going to lead to a long-term viable, sustainable future for the Ukrainian state. Let's not forget that the last time Ukraine was fully overrun by Moscow's forces, even though the country was occupied as a whole, armed resistance continued for more than a decade afterwards. And so we shouldn't expect that this is going to be over swiftly if the only terms under which it is over mean that Ukraine is effectively going to be extinct as a state.
What would increased European support look like in practice? Would it be the Germans, for example, saying, okay, we're going to give Taurus missiles? Would it be a no-fly zone being enforced? What does that look like in reality?
I'm sure there are a lot of options currently being discussed by European nations who will also be assessing how much of their military power can they actually use without US cooperation. Because if you are attempting to enforce a no-fly zone against the wishes of the United States, then obviously you're going to be limited in how much of American technology that's been supplied to you can employ it as for that purpose if the United States is aiming to actively oppose it. So all of these calculations, all of these attempts to work out how reliant Western military forces actually now are on United States goodwill will be part of the equation for thinking how Russia can be stopped and whether that is in Ukraine or further back.
And of course, Ukraine has been very reliant on Elon Musk's Starlink satellite system. And you wonder if these conversations continue to turn sour between the US and Ukraine, whether they may withdraw Ukraine's ability to use that.
Again, I've no doubt that this is precisely the kind of calculation that will be ongoing now in European capitals and in Kyiv. What happens if each of these methods of support and each of these underpinning frameworks of military capability that the United States has provided is turned off or taken away? What is still feasible?
Zelensky, of course, is a master politician, and he has been very clever at playing various international leaders ever since the full-scale invasion happened back in 2022. But I wonder if he knew that there was a chance that this meeting would turn sour. And I wonder if he thought, do you know what, that's a risk I'm prepared to take. Because if the worst comes to the worst and Trump were to pull the rug from under Ukraine's feet and withdraw all US support, at least that is a final wake-up call for Ukraine's European allies.
Well, every time the wake-up calls come, we think it's going to be the final one for Ukraine's European allies, and finally there will be action and response over and above a panicked realization that, again, the time has come, but nothing is done about it. Yes, I'm sure Zelensky will have been prepared for something along these lines and will have known that this is a risk that had happened. But after all, if you're dealing with a president that one day calls you a dictator and the next day says that he couldn't possibly have said that, it's hard to decide which is more worrying. Is that just serious cognitive decline on his part, or is it that he just wants to create the reality that suits him at that particular time of day? Either one is going to make it incredibly difficult for any foreign leader to deal with. And Zelensky, of course, is in this position of intense vulnerability, which is what Trump and Vance and the others in the room appear to be trying to exploit now.
Where most analysts would agree that Trump and Vance and the Americans have a point is that for too long, maybe Europe has underspent on defence and relied on the security umbrella that the US has provided on the continent. But the debate that's happening now about defence budgets, and of course in the UK, Keir Starmer has now pledged to increase the UK's defence budget from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5%. Is that almost a bit of a distraction? Because whilst that is important in the long term, right now, that's not going to have any impact on Ukraine.
Well, it will have barely any impact on British defence capability. As you will have seen the reporting both before and after this announcement, 2.5% will barely touch the sides because of the cumulative impact of all of the decades of cuts. But yes, it's been clear for some time that this is an irrelevant measure of defense effectiveness. It has only really served its purpose as a badge of shame for those countries that don't come up to a metric that was set 10 years ago. What's far more important now for directing spending is looking at not the input, not how much money goes in, but what it actually buys that is militarily relevant now. And there we have a set of templates for what is required to defend Europe in the form of NATO's regional plans, and the gaps between what allies have promised to make those work and what they're actually capable of delivering should be serving as a guide to what needs to be invested in rather than arbitrary figures plucked as a percentage of fluctuating national wealth. But here again, the US approach upends all of the assumptions around which that was built. And so with the United States not being in a position where it is going to absolutely guarantee that it will fill its part in all of those plans for the defense of Europe. Again, it requires a complete, not just recalibration, but also effectively starting from scratch for defense planning across the continent.
Just a couple of other things. Apparently, Volodymyr Zelensky challenged JD Vance and said, have you been to Ukraine? Have you actually seen our problems? Donald Trump appeared visibly frustrated, interjecting, don't tell us what we're going to feel. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good and very strong. Apparently, Zelensky also asked Trump for licenses for Ukraine to produce US weapons in Ukraine. Trump apparently turned this down. I mean, would they have the capacity at the moment? Would they have the military industrial base to produce those weapons? And could they do it anyway without a license?
Well, one of the proposals that's been put forward repeatedly for trying to support Ukraine and ensuring that its economy can continue to function while Russia is doing its very best to stop it is actually investing in that very in that very flexible, adaptable, and innovative Ukrainian defense industry, actually creating weapons within the country as opposed to buying them abroad and shipping them in. So that's been a proposal that's been on the table for a long time, and it makes sense for both the United States and for Ukraine for US weapons to be manufactured under license there if it is feasible, because then there is the profit motive for the United States as well as the actual practical aid to the Ukrainian armed forces, much more effective and much less subject to those temporary aid cutoffs, possibly permanent aid cutoffs that we've seen happening previously. So it is a sensible idea, and it would not have been put forward by Zelensky if it were not feasible. But again, we should not be surprised that this is being squelched instantly by Trump.
Keir, we really appreciate your time, especially responding to these events as they're unfolding. Just finally, I'll put one final quote to you and get your response. Apparently, Donald Trump has told Zelensky, make a deal or we're out. Mm-hmm. If that is the kind of final ultimatum, if you're Volodymyr Zelensky and you're presented with, okay, we can either have a deal that signs away much of our sovereignty, that gives Vladimir Putin a diplomatic win, or we lose US military aid and have to find some way of fighting on, what in your view should he do?
Well, this is the tragedy of the situation. Without knowing the fine detail, we cannot say, especially from outside the country, what would be the preferable option. But here you have Zelensky caught between impossible demands put to him by an invader from the east, by Russia, and impossible demands put to him by the country that up until recently was helping Ukraine resist. And if it's a choice between which of those is the worse, that just tells you how tragic the situation now is, that the United States has effectively changed sides.
Keir Giles, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you.